So we're about to jump into AP World History, Period 5, Key Concept 5.2. It's really focused on imperialism, and there's a lot of content in this key concept, but I'm going to really break it down so you know exactly what to study, and you stay focused on the most important details. All right, here we go. Okay, going forward to Key Concept 5.2, this is focused on imperialism and state building. So the industrializing powers had really begun to establish these transoceanic empires. And because of that, a lot of different states are going to expand and other ones will decline because of the new competitions around imperialism. So we're seeing some of the colonies that had already existed, like India, which was a colony of Britain, and Indonesia, which was a colony of the Dutch in the Netherlands. These colonies are going to strengthen because Britain, for example, is going to put more efforts and resources into really building up the economy in India, especially the cotton production. So, for example, during the U.S. Civil War in the mid-19th century, because the United States was not producing as much cotton because the South was, engaged in the war, Britain has to kind of look elsewhere for cotton production. The demand in Britain is still there. So they start to really implement industrialization in India in order to produce the cotton that is in demand in Europe. So some of the states are also expanding. Great Britain, the U.S., Japan, they're really going out and finding more colonies, more places to really exploit. They're taking resources from them. So we're seeing those empires really expand, where at the same time, some of the major empires from the last period are really in decline now, the Spanish and the Portuguese. So because of the expansion of other states, the Spanish, for example, are losing colonies, like, for example, the Philippines. So some of the methods that the westernized countries use to colonize, to take and exploit these other places in Africa and Asia and within the Americas, you can see that through diplomacy. So, for example, the powers in, the U.S. government would sign a treaty with a Native American tribe in order to take land from them. And, even though these were peaceful measures, relatively peaceful, they were by no means fair. And a good example of that is also the Berlin Conference. So imagine the Berlin Conference are, a bunch of white guys from Europe hanging around a table, and they're just completely dividing up Africa. Hey, Germany, you get this, and France, you get this, and Britain, you get this. And so it's peaceful, but it's not fair. There were no African representatives at that conference, and all the land in Africa was divided up. When you look at a map of Africa today, you can see a lot of straight lines, and those are really lingering consequences of that Berlin Conference. Another method would have been warfare. So, for example, Belgians in the Congo, King Leopold wanted to take control of the Congo, especially for rubber. So warfare was another major tactic. And then another one would have been economic. So with economic imperialism, you're not necessarily building the state within. You're not there to necessarily control all methods of everything as part of the state, but you are going to exploit a certain economy. So a really good example of that is opium in China. So, it's not that Great Britain had complete control of China. China was never a colony, but they really exploited the Chinese through opium by several different means, and that is a form of imperialism. In Latin America, we're seeing what's called neo-colonialism, and this was where it's kind of like economic imperialism, but instead of just taking, they were kind of investing in certain parts, but then exploiting in some of those investments and some of those businesses. So, for example, the United Fruit Company. And then finally, settler colonies. So, in some cases, like with South Africa or the United States, we're seeing, Great Britain has control of these places, but they're having people move there. They're becoming places for Europeans to settle. So in the U.S., you have people who were discriminated against in Great Britain or in Europe moving to the United States or to South Africa or Australia. So some of those settler colonies was another way of exploiting. So just as a point of reference here, a good comparison question might be to look at methods used by the West and compare those. So if you keep note of these different examples, you might be able to write that thesis statement better. So imperialism itself really led to state building and, of course, contraction of other states. So while some states were expanding, others were contracting. So we're really seeing the expansion of the United States and European influence. And you can see that in places like Japan and Tokugawa, Japan. So the Meiji reformations are happening at this time, and they're being heavily influenced by the United States and by Europe. The US and Russia and Japan are all really expanding their borders, and they're conquering other places and settling in other territories. And those are happening kind of like in neighboring places, right? Like the United States expands just from being just the 13 colonies all the way to the west by 1900. That's a lot of territory to expand in just 150 years. And because of those expansions, anti-imperialist resistance is definitely a factor here. So, in the United States, the expansion wasn't met without resistance. Native Americans across the country resisted in different ways. For example, the Cherokee. And some of those resistance movements were peaceful, and some of them were very much not. But we're seeing those that are being exploited standing up and resisting those movements. And there are examples of those in Africa with the Zulu kingdom, and in the Balkans, and in India with the Sepoy Mutiny in 1857. And so, mostly, it's like white Western countries that are practicing imperialism, and there were means that they had developed to justify this process. And so one of those examples is social Darwinism, which is basically the idea that there is a hierarchy of race, and that white people are on the top of that hierarchy, with Asians below and black populations just below that. And social Darwinism was a means to justify imperialism, feeding into like the white man's burden, where it was the white man's duty to help the people around the world that were unable to help themselves. And these two ideologies, these two means are completely ridiculous when you really read them. And they're extremely racist, and they're specifically using science as a way to justify racism. And in the 1900s, in the 20th century, we're going to see some extremely violent ways that people really dug into those theories and have practiced them. And so keep in mind that those two means to justify imperialism, may have helped white people feel better about it, but it definitely did not help the rest of the world feel, any type of way about that. So this is a cartoon that you might see in a DBQ about this time period. What this cartoon is showing is Cecil Rhodes, who was a British imperialist, right? So he is, you can see him just standing across Africa. He's got one foot in South Africa in Cape Town and the other in Cairo in Egypt. And both of those are British colonies. And so today we're actually seeing a lot of resistance movements in South Africa, in particular around the monuments that are still up of Cecil Rhodes. They're kind of these remnants of this colonial period. And they're kind of similar. It's like a synthesis piece of the movements today in the United States to take down Confederate monuments. So, we're seeing these remnants of this time period today, but these people who were idolized by westernized countries, were not idolized in the places that they were exploiting. People did not like Cecil Rhodes in South Africa, but he was a hero in Britain. There's another example of imperialism. This is in the United States. So the Manifest Destiny would have been an example of that means to justify the end. The idea that, it was the duty of Americans to move west, to reach the Pacific and expand across the entire continent. So this is a good example of that, of what we're seeing, this idea that it was their duty. And you can even see Native Americans and the buffalo that have to keep moving. It's like the trains are chasing them west. The the Americans are chasing them west. So it's kind of a sad picture when you really look specifically at the Native Americans on that left side. Hey, this is High Level History with Miss Emerald. Be sure to subscribe for more AP World History videos. Follow me on Instagram at High Level History for a woke version of your AP World textbook.